the joke that Trump kind of made as he was welcoming him in was very Trumpian and was actually in good humor. So where did this seem to go off the rails in the White House? Was it the insults from Zelensky or was it something else?
No, I think it was basically he was trying to, from having watched it, he was basically trying to insert some extra provisions. He was insisting on, the quote is, security guarantees. Now, with the mineral deal being done, and a lot of the areas that are mineral rich happen to be near, let's say, the line of contact where the fighting is going on. Basically, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, in fact, if the U.S. and Ukraine were going to collaborate on minerals, that the United States would be kind of near the line of contact. In other words, that's sort of if there's American mining companies there or whatever, that's sort of a guarantee that things aren't going to get out of hand because there are Americans in these areas. And that wasn't good enough for Zelensky. Zelensky should also understand that the way Trump is, his character, he would brook no betrayal of a peace treaty. I mean, if Putin were to attack Ukraine after a peace treaty was signed, that would be, I think, interpreted by Trump as a personal affront. It would enrage him, and then Russia would suffer the consequences. So, in other words, these security guarantees, quote unquote, were already implicit in the agreement. But that wasn't good enough for Zelensky. Zelensky had to go an extra step, maybe because he's used to dealing with a brain-dead Biden or the EU or the Biden administration, which bent over backwards to give him anything he wanted. He just had to get that final word in, and by doing so, he destroyed himself.
Well, and which is never a good idea when you're going up against Donald Trump. I'm speaking with Scott Uhlinger, who is a former naval officer, about this Oval Office meeting that has become the topic, of course, over the weekend. So now these other European nations are, I think, getting more involved potentially. Really, Trump has told them for a while, hey, you're not really doing anything to help this conflict. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer basically said, we want to put together this package, we want to help, but we can't do that without the United States being on board. So where does this go from here? And is this sort of just posturing from some of the other European countries?
Well, that's a very interesting question because really in all of this, the strangest, most contradictory behavior is with the Europeans. Listeners have to understand, I was in the CIA and the Navy. I spent years operating in NATO navies, and I have literally a real-life experience dealing with NATO navies. But this is, when I'm talking about the 90s, then between the 90s and the year 2025, the capability of the European militaries has gone down immeasurably, like two-thirds lower than what I remember. They've spent all their money on social services, illegal immigrants, and they have no money for defense. And this is one thing that Trump was making a big deal of in the first term. And he was absolutely right. I've been noting it for 20 years myself. So the Europeans tend to act like they have some kind of a military capability, like that they could send peacekeepers in. The Europeans would be strained to send 30,000 peacekeepers in. The British Army has as many tanks as the National Guard of Pennsylvania. It really is pathetic if you look at the numbers. But these countries insist on wanting a place at the table as if they're real players. It's like a midget taking on Michael Tyson. It's insane. Now, Starmer now seems to maybe be getting a little bit of a clue as to realism, saying that he really does need the United States to lead. And it's absolutely a fact. That's why Putin wouldn't even waste his time talking to the Europeans. The Europeans also seem to be halfway inclined to continue the war, as if that would be a good thing for Europe, which it certainly would not be. Clearly, peace is the only solution in this case. Ukraine has done a good job, but cannot do any more. And we have to be realistic and sit down. The Europeans seem relatively speaking, to be just ignoring this reality. Maybe now they're coming around a little bit. Maybe now they'll come to Trump and propose something that might involve, you got to keep the two warring parties apart. So that would involve a peacekeeping force, which Trump has insisted the United States will not take part in, as he is correct in saying, because this is the Europeans' backyard. It literally is in Europe. And so the onus is on them to provide, to contribute to the mission. And so maybe this fallout will result in the Europeans making an actual contribution to the mission. So it's possible that we may be able to salvage something out of this. But Trump's insistence, which is very important and very good, his insistence that he is willing to walk away from a bad deal is absolutely essential. It's very clear he's willing to do that, and that has left the Europeans scrambling.
Which Donald Trump has got to know all of this, right? That the European leaders can't really make all that much of a difference without the United States. And I was frankly surprised to hear Keir Starmer just say that so bluntly, which is an acknowledgement of Donald Trump's superior negotiating position, which I'm sure he appreciated that at least, just in that respect. But where is the United States in this in terms of just our national interest or some kind of metric for which we should be contributing to Ukraine? I mean, obviously there is the flip side of this to say, well, if you're not for Ukraine, then you're for Russia and Putin, which is, the worst. I mean, that's like the worst thing you could say in America right now, probably even over, calling him a racist, Trump. Oh, if Trump is for Putin, that's really bad, but nobody has really identified an American interest. And polls have also suggested that American sentiment toward Ukraine is really divided and very significantly among partisan lines. Quickly, a CBS poll that was just published yesterday found that 52% of respondents back Ukraine in its conflict with Russia, while 44% remain neutral and only 4% support Russia. And I think the neutrality here is really where a lot of conservatives are saying, like, this is more of Europe's problem. Like, why is America involved to begin with?
Right. Certainly, if Trump, basically in an attempt to get back some of the money, the huge amounts of money that we've sent Ukraine, the mineral deal would mean there would be some U.S. interests. But basically, there is a lack of U.S. interests. And also another thing in the chess game of foreign diplomacy is that what the United States is really concerned about, as well it should be, is China. Okay, China's increased aggression in the Pacific. The United States is looking at pivoting away from Europe, which it has been focused on for more than 45, 50 years. So for the first time in 50 years, we are trying to pivot to the east because the real threat is China. And so part of the strategy of concluding this Ukrainian deal, first of all, it's common sense to want to do that, is that it's an attempt, it is also gives us the benefit of at least trying, to peel Russia away from China a little bit, because the two of them together, China's manpower and capability combined with Russian national resources, is not a good thing for the United States. So we're trying to get something out of this by peeling maybe Russia away from China a little bit, by making it less of an enemy. It may be deemed to failure, but it's worth a try. Is I think an integral part of the U.S. strategy, because we're looking 5 years ahead or so, and war with China could be coming the same way that war with Japan was increasingly obvious in 1935. So this is all part of the international chess game, and that's where we're at right now, I think.
Which is a really interesting position, I think, and way better to have Donald Trump at the helm of negotiating this for the United States, and of course Secretary of State Marco Rubio, instead of obviously the Biden administration that nobody just trusted Biden to be doing anything, and now that there are even aides that are admitting that Biden didn't have his full mental faculties during the presidency is just shocking and wild. But where are we at, Scott Uhlinger, in terms of Ukraine's consistent request, I don't know if it's necessarily a demand, but at least their request to join NATO. I mean, Zelensky has even said he would step down as president if that were to happen, which, of course, that just plays into what he's asking in terms of the security backing over anything else.
Well, that's just, I think at this point, that's just not going to happen. But keep in mind that even right now in its weakened state, with less money coming in, the Ukrainian military capability is probably greater than most of NATO combined, except maybe France and England. The Ukrainians retain a distinct combat ability, and so in other words, that guarantees that there will not be a resumption of the war because they still have that ability. So I think that combined with Trump's skeptical view of NATO means that Ukraine really doesn't have a path into NATO.
And I think that's probably accurate analysis, and particularly because of where Russia is seated. And so let's also talk quickly before I let you go, Scott Eulinger, about the Democrats in all of this. I mean, obviously, nobody really cares when they're in the minority what they have to say, but Zelensky might have. Senator Amy Klobuchar posted a photo of her and another senator, and then Lindsey Graham, which I'm kind of like, well, that's in a sense a cadre of Democrats. We'll just, he's the warmonger. We'll just throw him in there too. But with Zelensky ahead of the White House meeting, so there's some speculation that perhaps that meeting was advising Zelensky to go into the Oval Office and be as pushy and maybe brash, however you want to characterize it, in the Oval Office meeting. And then Lindsey Graham, of course, then comes out and supports Trump after that, maybe because he knows the optics won't be favorable to him if something came out of that meeting. But do you think that there's any truth to that speculation?
I think that it might be true that they were giving him, quote, advice on how to tackle Trump, but it's clear, that the advice was absolutely wrong. I certainly would have advised nothing of the kind. So it is possible that they kind of goaded him or encouraged him to try to create a little bit of a flap, which certainly happened. So that was bad. And it is interesting that Lindsey Graham was very willing to disavow Zelensky, as you pointed out, because the optics were so disastrous that even Lindsey Graham would look ridiculous supporting Zelensky at that point. I guess you have to understand the Democratic view. Why this support of Zelensky? Liberals and Democrats, believe me, as a Russian speaker who chased after Russians in the CIA, I say this with authority, that Democrats for 50 years have been apologists of the Russians. Why this sudden switch? And it has to do with globalism, because they want to support a globalist, like forever war that enriches the arms manufacturers of the world and doesn't, basically it's a very short-term view. Okay, let's just keep this war going, kill Russians, and we make, Raytheon and Grumman more wealthy, and everything's hunky-dory. But Americans are increasingly rejecting this globalist view. The European elite, not the people, since they dominate and they run the EU with their suppression of civil rights and stuff, the EU is absolutely still in the globalist camp. And that is why they still seem to support Zelensky to the nth degree, even after this disaster of a press conference. Trump obviously is an anti-globalist candidate, and it's another reason why the Europeans really hate him, because he calls out the truths of life in Europe, etc., and they hate that. But that is like the source. This globalist view is the source of the support for Zelensky and the hatred of Putin, even though, like I said, 20 years ago, the Democrats were very happy to be Putin's lapdog. Now suddenly they're on the opposite side because it suits their interests.
And isn't that always how it is? It's always about something else than what it appears to be. And this is why commentary with authority like yours, Scott Eulinger, is so important to actually understanding the fuller situation. And it was fascinating to me. Elon Musk posted or reposted a photo, and it was almost like a cartoon depiction yesterday on X that showed a chessboard and had all of the white and black pieces other than the kings and queens that were off to the side.
I've seen it.
all of those, that were basically dead on the battlefield, looking bloodied, and then on the side, the kings and queens, both the black and the white. For listeners who haven't seen it, we're sitting off to the side at a table having dinner together, and I thought, what a perfect picture of what war does to countries.
Right, and this war is more. It's this break between the wants of the globalists and the regular people. This war is even more distinct than most. You could argue World War II was a war of necessity. World War I was not. But this war, maybe started as a war of necessity in the sense that, okay, Russia did invade. But at the end of the day, Trump is concerned about saving lives because so many lives have been lost, about 1 million total casualties, deaths, and people wounded. And it just has to end because are we just going to contribute? Are the Europeans and the United States going to contribute money until literally the last Ukrainian is dead? How does that benefit the human race and Ukraine in particular?
Yeah, well said. And this is also why so many people are so against the United States potentially having boots on the ground or any kind of escalation like that. Certainly, as a taxpayer, I would love to see us get some of our money back, but at the cost of the human casualties, that's certainly a moral question beyond just these globalist warmongers. So, Scott Eulinger, this is going to be really fascinating to see how all of this plays out. Always appreciate your commentary, and we will be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis in the Morning.
The words you are about to hear are taken from letters sent in by members of the Trinity Debt Management Program.
Dear Trinity, today I'm making my final credit card payment.
Before I came to you, I was in a constant state of anxiety and panic, but now there is hope for my family's financial future.
Working with Trinity made me understand that I'm not alone.
You really do help people.
Your kindness will never be forgotten.
Without Trinity's support, I would not have achieved my lifelong goal of becoming debt-free.
We saved a lot on interest and penalties, of course, but the reward was the gift of human kindness.
Trinity has carried me through a very difficult time in my life. You're amazing.
I used to feel so anxious and hopeless. Now I feel grace and peace.
God bless Trinity as you continue to help others become debt-free.
If credit card debt has you down, call Trinity at 1-800-788-1813. That's 1-800-788-1813.
As Christians, how can we even begin to impact others when we live in a culture where truth is relative? It all starts with God's Word. Join us for Activate Summit 2025 at Cadence Bank Conference Center in Tupelo, Mississippi, June 12th through the 14th, 2025. The theme is Biblical Bedrock, building on the authority of Scripture, and it's designed to help you acknowledge the Bible's authority and submit to the clear teaching of Scripture. Hear from Abraham Hamilton III.
The Lord has planted us here so that we make our space better.
Ed Battagliano.
We use those kind of terms, be the hands and feet of Jesus. What would Jesus do if he were here?
And Alex McFarland.
God created because it was his will.
The main sessions are for ages 13 and up, while Activate Kids is a separate track for ages 6 through 12. Register for Activate Summit 2025 by visiting activate.afa.net/summit.
Activate Summit 2025.
Activate.afa.net/summit.
Hello, Americans. I'm Todd Starnes. Stand by for news and commentary next. There's a good chance your local weather guesser got the boot today. Hundreds of staffers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration losing their jobs. It's part of the Department of Government Efficiency's plans to slash the federal workforce. Nearly 400 probationary employees were let go. Now, those are the folks in charge of day-to-day forecasting and posting severe weather warnings. It turns out NOAA has about 12,000 staffers across the world, nearly 7,000 scientists. Democrats will no doubt accuse President Trump of putting people's lives in danger. How will we know when a tornado's coming? Well, if the wind's blowing really hard and you hear something that sounds like a freight train, you better jump in the bathtub. As for your 7-day forecast, just walk out onto your front porch. If it's raining, grab an umbrella. If it's cold, grab a jacket. You know what? That advice probably just saved the American taxpayers about $1 billion. I'm Todd Stearns.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. And over the weekend as well, beyond the Oval Office meeting with Trump and Zelensky, there were two other controversies that conservatives have been discussing, mainly Andrew Tate and the Tate brothers returning to America as U.S.-UK dual citizens from Romania, and then also the release, or really non-release, and the utter disappointment of the Epstein files. So these are two topics that have been really controversial with a lot of different opinions, and I want to comment on both of those and give you my take on both of those controversies. But before we do that, I think it's very important for us at the American Family Radio Network and our AFR family as Christians to understand first how to think through some of these issues before we just go and take them as they come. And of course, for regular listeners of this show, we talk about the biblical worldview all the time. And so if you are a new listener, this will be even more important, I think, for you. But for people who've been regular listeners, even before I started here, I think it's always important to come back to the foundation, because otherwise we can very easily try to just address issue by issue without saying, okay, first of all, we need to understand what a biblical worldview lens is. And I love when this happens, and it happens so frequently, I think, just because, the Bible always speaks to things that are so relevant in how we are to live as Christians. But my pastor yesterday at church talked about exactly this, and it was the perfect setup. And so I want to borrow some of my notes from yesterday's sermon as we lay this out and talk about how we need to build our foundation as Christians first before we address various topics or conflicts. And this is true for any issue. This is true for decision making as an individual Christian. This is true for decisions you make as a family, parents make for kids, how you treat each other, how we recognize who is our neighbor. That's a question the leftists always love to ask. And it's also true for how we engage civil society and how we engage different types of questions, news events, and controversy, and how we always frame kind of the civil government view in the constitutional framework. I always like to say, and it's true, that our rights are God-given, they're pre-political. And so we first have to understand what our rights are before then we can argue how the Constitution is designed to preserve and protect those rights, and how we have the freedom and liberty for free exercise, and then how the government is not permitted to infringe upon those rights. But the point of our rights being pre-political is exactly the same point that our morality should be pre-political. Our foundation needs to be pre-political. Our foundation of moral truth is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Because why? God, as the divine lawgiver, as the person of truth, does not change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So the exact same morality, the same truth, the same nature of God's character has been true for every political question, cultural question, family question, Christian life question throughout human history. Now, the application might be different because different circumstances or contexts, but the moral principle remains the same. That's why truth is objective, not subjective. This is why we don't go with the cultural sway. We don't go with our emotions. We don't go with societal expectations. We don't modify our morals based on the culture or the politics. We always have to have that firm foundation in objective truth. And this is why the Bible talks about rightly dividing truth from error, and why the Bible gives us the master plan of how we live our Christian life according to those principles. Now, in the very same way, when we talk about, for example, the context of the First Amendment and protecting the pre-political right to free speech or free exercise of religion, those things, free speech looks different today in 2025, and the platform of social media or the platform of radio that we're communicating on right now. That's different, and those options weren't available when the founders ratified the original Constitution in 1787, and then, of course, later the Bill of Rights. But that doesn't mean that our right to speak freely and that principle has changed, or that right has changed. The application and how we address those issues in 2025 may have a different application, but the principle is still the same. And the exact same principle is true for moral truth. And so my pastor was talking yesterday from Matthew 7, and starting in verse 24, and I'm sure for the Christians, you have all heard this before, the words of Jesus, and how he talked a lot in allegory and examples. This is about the wise and foolish builders. So chapter 7 in Matthew, verse 24, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So the example here, and the analogy, of course, it comes after talking about true and false disciples. So as everyone who is raised in perhaps a Baptist background always knows that when you start with therefore, what's the response to that? You always want to know what it's there for, the therefore, because it comes after something else, right? So going back to up to verse 15, and then even ahead of that, verse 13, Jesus is talking first about salvation. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life. Only a few find it. So then he is talking about true and false prophets, and then true and false disciples. So verse 21 says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, Jesus is speaking, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. This is a serious admonishment that not everyone who calls themselves a Christian or a disciple of Christ or a believer is genuine. And we need to be very careful. That means to not only know that we are true disciples and living the principles of Scripture and understand the truth of the gospel of salvation, but be a true disciple, following the commands of the Lord. And this is all pre-political, right? I mean, this does not depend on whether you are a Democrat or Republican, a Trump supporter or not, or whatever. This has nothing to do with the current political commentary and the controversy of our day. This is true from a not only salvific standpoint, but also moral uprightness and integrity, living our life according to Christ. And so then, after commenting on the true and false disciples, Jesus goes on to then give the allegory of the wise and foolish builders. And it struck me yesterday as I was listening to my pastor preaching on this, that I had kind of thought of the wise and foolish builders as the believers and the unbelievers. Like the people who are just out living in sin, they're building their foundation on sand and they are very foolish. And then when the storms came, the trials, the testing of our foundation, that's of course the part of the allegory here, then of course their house is going to be wiped away because they're not even trying to build with integrity. They're not trying to build on a moral foundation. But the foolish builder is the person who claims to be a Christian, but then builds their foundation on principles other than the truth of the gospel of Christ. And if you build your foundation wrongly, and it's not upon the principles of God, then as you are building up, and then the winds come and the trials and the testing, then you are not built on a firm foundation. And Christians need to be very mindful of that, because we have to be solidly so well in our foundation and be a wise man, building our house, building our, and my pastor made the point that, in this context, this was talking about the house would be like the household, the name of the person. And this can be the individual Christian, this can be your family, and this is who you are as a Christian and as a family unit. Are you building your foundation on the principles and the truth of Christ? And so what does that actually mean when we're talking about this from a concrete sense? Because a lot of Christians would say, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. I try not to sin. I go to church every Sunday maybe, or, I'm living my life the best way I can. And so it's a little bit esoteric. But what does sand actually mean? What does that look like? And my pastor broke it down into two categories: emotions and expectations. Because if you don't have objective truth that is grounded in the character and person of God, but you are making your decisions based on your emotions, how you feel in a given moment, what is self-satisfying, what you feel like doing in any given scenario, that is subjective. That is shakeable. Or if you are building your foundation on expectations, that is also a category of sand. That truth is subjective. So what would expectations be? Well, what does a politician think? What do social media influencers think? What does your reputation look like according to social media? This is always changing, because political policies change. Politicians change. Their cultures even change. Cultural expectations change. So that is a huge problem, that both emotions and expectations don't start with God and truth. They start with man's opinion, man's feelings. And how many of us have seen the cultural push to make decisions based on either our emotions or a bandwagon kind of fallacy where, well, this is the expectation of, what the Republican Party wants, or what MAGA wants, or, all the cool kids are doing it. This is all the social media influencing. And there's a reason why social media and influencing is very powerful, and why a lot of money is spent into these campaigns, because it's basically purposefully building a psychological bandwagon fallacy. Because if everybody who you are following on social media, all of the news shows, every Fox News commentator, everybody is saying, and there's not one other opinion, then you want to join the popular crowd. You go, oh, well, that must be right then. And we need to, as Christians, be very careful that we don't fall into the trap of the bandwagon fallacy, or the expectations of certain groups of society or the culture, before we fundamentally are grounded in truth. And this can become very difficult, because when Matthew 7 and when Jesus is talking about the rain coming and the streams rising and the winds blowing and beating against your foundation, it's not, hey, if that comes, sometime you might want to be prepared. It's that will come. There will come a testing of our faith, and it may be in more mild or more minor ways daily that we're confronted with decisions. How do we respond when we're offended? For example, do we treat our neighbor with love? Do we speak truth actually in love? Do we cower in silence? I mean, all of these things that are daily questions. But then there will be the bigger trials and the bigger temptations to look at different issues from a perspective that is either completely opposed to Christ, like saying, hey, you know what, the Republican platform now is okay with gay marriage, so, I'm just, well, I'm not personally for it, like, I can't really condemn that, and I don't want to have an opinion on that, or, well, I personally wouldn't ever have an abortion, like, I can't make a judgment on somebody else's life, all of those things. I mean, that's diametrically opposed to the person of truth and the character and nature of God. Why? Because God himself tells us that all human beings are created in the image of God, and have an inherent right not only to life, but dignity and value, and that abortion is morally wrong and not justified. And we see in Genesis, pre-culture, pre-political, that God himself ordained the institution of marriage as between one man and one woman. This is part of natural law. Nature and the laws of nature and of nature's God tell us what a marriage is, and we have no authority to change that. Now, we can either actively oppose that and be completely against truth, or we can maybe, twist it just a little bit and try to couch it differently and kind of straddle the fence in some ways. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to respond unbiblically and build that foundation on sand versus standing firm on a firm foundation. And for a lot of you that have followed me for a really long time, know that, trials and tribulations have come in my life in various forms and ways. And I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that if I were not firm in my foundation of understanding the principles of truth, and to say that my Savior and following the Lord and standing firm for truth and speaking truth were not at the core of who I am and the core of what I understand is required of me. It's not voluntary, it is required of me in my Christian life. Then it would have been a much, much more difficult trial. All of the things that I faced in my life, but a lot of things very prominently. And it's not to say that it was easy going through those things, and it's not to say that it was an easy decision to make, knowing I would get a lot of, hate from a lot of different people and a lot of criticism that's unfounded and a lot of false accusations, all of that. But at the end of the day, standing firm on truth and being willing to speak truth and be willing to say the principles of morality and the character and nature of God matter more than man's opinion. It matters more than politics and politicians. It matters more than the cultural expectations, perception, any of that. I fear God and not man. When trials come, if you have built your house on a firm foundation, then yeah, it's not fun going through the hurricane. I mean, I can tell you that as a Floridian now. It's not fun, but you will withstand it. And so I want to take a break here, and then we're going to come back and talk about these two controversies and how the conservatives are talking about them and how we should be talking about them if we have a pre-political understanding of truth, and if we are grounded in truth, and if we are, as Proverbs 3 verses 5 and 6 says, trusting in the Lord with all our heart, leaning not unto our own understanding, in all our ways acknowledging Him, acknowledging truth, He will direct our path. And it becomes so much simpler to understand how to think through these things if we have built our foundation solidly on Christ and fear God, not man. We'll be right back with more.
Hello, I'm Sam Rohr, president of the American Pastors Network, a growing national network of pastors committed to the authority of Scripture and preaching the whole counsel of God. We believe biblical obedience is the foundation for revival, and impacting our culture for Christ is our duty. For too long, the pulpits of America have been silent on the important issues such as marriage and family and assault on our liberty. Join us in the battle for truth on Stand in the Gap weekend, Sunday evenings at 6 p.m. on American Family Radio, and visit us at AmericanPastorsNetwork.org.
Fostering and adoption is not a Band-Aid for infertility. It is a calling, and God can change the desire of your heart and make that so rewarding. It's the most beautiful, selfless thing. It's pure religion, but it's not a fix to I desire biological child. God has to deal with that in your heart separately.
Hannah's Heart, encouraging couples through infertility and miscarriage. Saturdays, 4 a.m. Central on AFR or on the AFR app.
You must not turn aside, for then you would go after futile things which cannot profit or deliver, because they are futile. My name is Abraham Hamilton III, and this is the Hamilton Minute. Samuel admonished the Israelites, do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. The inevitable consequence of turning aside from the Lord is that you will give yourself to futility, to things that cannot profit or deliver. Do you want your life to mean something? Do you want it to count? You actually were created for life eternal. The only way forward is to give your life wholeheartedly to Christ. Eternal life is the only way to live now.
Listen each weekday from 5 to 6 p.m. Central for the Hamilton Corner with Abraham Hamilton III, Public Policy Analyst for the American Family Association.
Hey, 8 Days of Hope family. As God continues to expand this ministry, we cherish your involvement, whether that is through praying, volunteering, or donating. We know it can be hard to stay up to date on all that God is doing through 8 Days of Hope, and we'd hate for you to miss an opportunity to get involved. Today we invite you to find us on social media to see regular updates on how we are loving and serving those in need across the country through our Rebuilding, Rapid Response, Safe House, and Mass Feeding ministries. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music at 8 Days of Hope. That's EIGHT, Days of Hope. If you aren't on social media, we invite you to join our text alerts. Right now you can text the word HOPE to 86373, and you'll be notified anytime we deploy or have exciting news to share. It's that simple. Text HOPE, that's HOPE, to 86373. We can't wait to share updates with you soon.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back, and we're talking about living out the Christian life in the midst of a culture or a political ecosphere that is in times not consistent with the biblical worldview. And that's true for the overall godless populist movement, right? And there is a great movie that you really need to see that is an example of how to be a culture warrior, and it's in fact titled Culture Warrior, and it is about Don Wildman, the founder of AFA, and you can go to culturewarrior.movie to watch this movie that's titled Culture Warrior, Don Wildman and the Battle for Decency. Because as a conservative Christian, you can see an example of someone who saw what's going on in culture and responded biblically, and it's led to a movement and a platform that people like me now can speak truth on a daily basis and just increase that ministry. So go to culturewarrior.movie. So let's turn to these two controversies, and I want to start with Andrew Tate because I can't even stand talking about this guy because it just then gives him even more popularity and whatever. But I think that we need to, as Christians, because there is so much out here that is talking beyond the topic of moral truth. So a couple of days ago, my good friend Josh Hammer, who we have on regularly and who is an editor at Newsweek, put out an opinion column that was very aptly titled "The Andrew Tate Moral Rot and the Future of the American Right." And I would commend that to your reading because he's talking about this moral rot. And for those of you who don't know, this is part of the history of the Tate brothers, and this is part of what Josh Hammer writes. In 2023, Romanian authorities charged the Tate brothers with human trafficking, sexual abuse, money laundering, and forming an organized crime group to exploit and traffic women. Andrew Tate was also charged with rape. Last year, British authorities similarly procured an arrest warrant for the brothers. Andrew Tate, a convert to Islam and an unapologetic defender of Hamas, has used quote-unquote manliness to make a lot of claims that I won't even go on and read the rest of this article on air because they are just so disgusting. My friend John Root, who a lot of you know is a conservative commentator and influencer, posted a video. I was going to play a clip of this in Andrew Tate's own words that John Root was commenting on. And my producer even said, even if we bleep out some of this, it's too disgusting to even play on air. So that should give you a flavor of what Andrew Tate is advocating for. And under this concept of quote unquote manliness, it's this sort of macho kind of, not even just, the patriarchy, like men should make all the decisions. He's calling for actual crimes against women. And nothing whatsoever that Christians should emulate. And yet, because he has such a popular following, he has been platformed by so many conservatives and even influencers that some of you may listen to and go to. And this is why we need to be very careful consumers. And the Tampa Bay Young Republicans, which is a group that I have spoken to here in Florida, they posted this in the midst of this controversy as the Tate brothers are apparently coming to Florida or have already. TBYR, Tampa Bay Young Republicans, formally welcomes the Tates to Florida as free speech absolutists. The Tates haven't been formally convicted of any crimes and are welcome to speak to our group. We're old enough to remember when a quote-unquote convicted felon won the presidency. Hashtag free state. All right. So if we are not thinking Christianly and we're just looking at this, then like a lot of conservatives, you're kind of parsing this like, well, I disagree with what he says and, I'm not going to, but, hey, he has the right to speak it. And so since they haven't been convicted of any crimes, free speech and the right to innocence until proven guilty, all of those are American principles. So go team, Well, free speech is not the issue here. This is not about the government coming in, the American government coming in and trying to tell Andrew Tate, like, hey, you can't be this, insane machismo over here on social media. And then the principle of free speech might apply. There are some things that even the Supreme Court has recognized don't fall under free speech. By the way, hate speech not being one of them. That's a leftist thing. But if we're actually understanding the moral principle here, we don't, as Christians, say, well, they haven't been convicted of anything, so we're going to welcome them and celebrate them and platform their message under the auspices of free speech. And by the way, free speech absolutism does not mean that you welcome every speaker or affirm every message. And conservatives, even not Christians, have long fought for that very principle that the government cannot compel us to speak against our sincerely held religious beliefs or refrain from speaking them. So free speech absolutism does not mean that you say, hey, you haven't been convicted of a crime, so we gotta say, hey, we formally invite you and we welcome you and we platform you because we have to. That's actually a misconstruing and a twisting and a perverting of what First Amendment doctrine and free speech actually means. But that's not even the point. The point is that if we are looking at this through a moral lens, then we're not going to platform these people anyway. And I'm already running out of time, but we'll have to continue the conversation tomorrow because I wanted to comment on the Epstein files. And so I'll just tease this a little bit of how a lot of these influencers who are going around saying, well, because the Trump administration has allegedly and reportedly facilitated, Trump coming in, they're saying that they want to put out the Epstein files and all this. Well, we got to go along with that. We can't have any other opinion than supporting what the administration is doing because as conservatives, then that's always right. That is going along with expectations and building your house on sand because ultimately then you will be advocating for things that are diametrically opposed to your moral grounding as a Christian. And you will be people like Benny Johnson, who claims to be a Christian, like Alina Habba. I'm not sure if she claims to be a Christian or not, but who are going out and saying they're big fans of Andrew Tate, of platforming them, like the Young Republicans. and saying, well, hey, of course we disagree with what he says, but, they have been persecuted in the same way Trump has, so we need to champion them. No, we don't. Absolutely not. And so if we are going to look at the moral truth of an issue, pre-political, it doesn't matter what the expectation of MAGA or the expectation of the Republican Party or the expectation of the Democrat Party, the expectation of a politician, it doesn't matter. The question is, what does God expect of you? And God expects you to stand up firmly and call out the moral rot and say, no, we don't welcome people who are calling for beating and raping of women to be welcomed on a platform that is supposedly conservative, which should be the party of moral truth. It is totally, completely inconsistent. We have to start with morality before we even get to the conservative issues. We'll talk about this more tomorrow. Already out of time.
The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast